Great. I think everybody's coming into the session. My name's Olivia. I'm the founder of PressPad. I'm here. Sirin Kale. Is that how you say your name? I've only ever read it, so that's the problem with being a writer.
It's Sirin Kale.
Sirin Kale, perfect. Everybody here is absolutely wild to hear about your career. You've done so many amazing things. We're really, really excited to take you through some of the questions that we've had in advance. I'm just popping a link in the chat for everyone, which is a link to the transcription of this session, just so if you're hard of hearing or you want to just go back through it and have that to hand, that is going in here right now. We would love all of you guys to put as many questions, comments in the chat, just so it doesn't feel like both Sirin and I are just kind of chatting into the void. And I'm just going to wait for a few more people to stream in, because there are quite a lot of you that signed up for this, unsurprisingly, and then we will kick off and I will share a presentation with you guys, which will allow you to see sort of what questions we're going to go through. But again, if there's anything that you want to know about in particular, just drop us a note in the chat, and also let us know a little bit about who's here. Tell us, you know, who you are, where you're joining us from across the UK. It's always lovely and just makes you feel, again, a little less like you're broadcasting into a black hole. Right, I'm going to share screen. Sirin, just tell us, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really happy that people came. I didn't think anyone was going to come to my masterclass. Again, please, all the anonymous internet people out there behind the screen, please ask questions. I like answering questions. I don't like just talking about myself. But yeah, I'm very good, and I followed the work that PressPad does for a while, and it's great. So I'm really happy to be here.
Amazing. Somehow I'm on a new laptop, so it's not going to let me share the link to the presentation. So Sirin, I wondered if I should be allowing you to do it because you're a co-host.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I'm gonna have to just get out my emails. One sec.
Usually it's the wonderful Camille Dupont who's here, but she is getting married this week, so you've got me as a backup. But it just means that I haven't done all the tech before.
I'm going to see like how terrible my tabs are. So
hopefully, I think you can share just one tab. What, by the way, yes, talking of one tab, this is like my one recommendation to anyone who is a tab like fiend. Okay. Get one tab, because you can then reduce all of them. Brilliant. Yes. So if we present and we kick off with our first question, just at the top, you can click present on the top right.
Right.
Oh, yeah, or there. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Great.
And then, yeah, we are here. So we've got subtitles, which you should be able to see. And you can always tweet about this if you want to, using the hashtag PressPadRemote, and obviously tag Sirin in there. So we're going to start off by just asking, what inspired you to become a journalist?
So what inspired me to become a journalist? I always wanted to be a writer of some sort. I think lots of journalists are kind of the same sort of path that I followed, which is, you know, like loves books, really good at English at school, pretty terrible at everything else, doing numbers. And I wanted to be a journalist. I think I used to watch like CNN and see like Christian Amanpour, like in like a flat jacket getting shot at. I was like, oh, I really want to do that one day when I grow up. And then I went to university to do English Lit. And I graduated into the recession, like post-financial crisis. And I just had no idea how to be a journalist. It just seemed like incredibly daunting. And I didn't have any contacts that were journalists. And I was also definitely one of those university students who just like had fun and didn't like do any student journalism or anything like that. So I think by the age of 21, I was like, well, yeah, it's too late for me. Like that ship has sailed. It's too late for me to be a journalist. And so I sort of drifted around doing corporate jobs for a few years. And then, oh God, this is a really sort of like long-winded explanation. And then I think I just realized that like all I ever did at my corporate job was read journalism and think how good it was and how much I wanted to do that too. And especially like features journalism, like I used to read the New Yorker and just think how amazing that journalism was. So I think I kind of always wanted to be a journalist, but I just had no idea how to do it. And then I sort of fell into it in my 20s.
Incredible. Well, that is as good an answer as any. I think a lot of people do say that they just fall into it. But I think student journalism is a great chance to get going, but it's also good because loads of people don't actually go to university or get the chance to. So it's good to know that even if you didn't take those opportunities, that you can kind of start from a kind of standing start, because sometimes, yeah, I think nowadays everyone thinks, okay, you know, I'm 18 and I haven't, you know, won a Pulitzer, what have I been doing? But definitely it's a journey. So yeah, let's kick off with another question. It's also lovely to see we've got people joining us from Tbilisi, from New York City, Manchester, Cardiff, Leicester. This is great, and of course London. So yeah, you've obviously published a lot of different things. What has been your favorite story or article to work on? And if you let us know, I will find it and share it with everyone in the chat, so that if people haven't read it yet, you guys can go and read it and learn.
So I'm talking really fast, so I want to just cover as much ground as possible. I think probably my favorite story or article that I've worked on was a long read that I wrote for Wired magazine in 2020. And it was about this like community of people who lived in Bali that did this thing called drop shipping, which is this slightly crazy e-commerce scam, basically, where you buy stuff from Amazon, Chinese version of Amazon, and then you create a really slick website for it, and then you Facebook ad target it like people with too much disposable income and not enough sense, and then they buy it for ridiculously marked up margins. And the people who were doing this, they all lived in this sort of like digital nomad community, and they were all sort of like very jargony, and one of them had made enough money that he was actually able to buy a private island in Indonesia from doing this, from selling underwear to like French women, like Spanx basically. And I really enjoyed doing that story because I thought the people were so interesting, and the phenomenon they were describing was so interesting. For me, it was really a story about globalization, like that there was, you know, the story of how these sort of very small group of young people had kind of figured out a way to make a ton of money by exploiting globalized supply chains. But I also found it really interesting because it was one of those stories that has like great color, because everyone in it was like a really good character. Like I went to this desert island where there was no running water and there was no like electricity, and you know, this sort of very sort of like strange French man had just bought it because he'd made all this money from this like drop shipping scam basically. And I just really loved that because it felt like the sort of piece which I love to write, which is that it pulls together lots of quite big themes like the exploitation of labor, globalization, the internet. There was a lot in there about how all these young people were all college dropouts. They were all sort of just trying to make money through the internet because they thought that college is a scam. So it was like a really nice story because it pulled together a lot of themes, and also like it's obviously nice to be able to travel and report a story as well, even though I did have to take like 11 planes in 9 days in order to get around Indonesia in time.
Was that all during the pandemic? Because 2020, I mean, you would have thought that would have been the time where most, you know, writers are kind of bedding down and writing whatever book it is that they had planned to write.
This was so it came out in 2020, but I reported it in 2019. So yeah, pre-pandemic, God no, I would not imagine how anyone could get into Indonesia during COVID. That's definitely out of my skill set.
And in terms of when you're pitching this kind of a story, because with our workshops, we love to kind of get underneath the stories too, that mix of kind of like micro and macro, you know, like the small characters and then the bigger themes. How did you pitch that, you know, when you were first kind of approaching an editor with it? How did you like make that come to life, you know, because I think it's the quirky that about your writing that is so fantastic, but it may not be a kind of obvious sell necessarily, or did you find that to be the opposite?
So there was like sort of it was like a two-step process to pitch and get that commission. So the first step was basically like, here's this crazy scene and this is the things that they do, and these are like, this is, you know, like this is the trend and the phenomenon that I want to explore. And then my editor Vicky was like, yeah, that's interesting. And then I was like, she was like, can you go away and tell me who your characters are going to be? And then I went away and was like, okay, here are like 3 people that I think are really, really interesting, and I would like to speak to these people. And that's where you get more into like the sort of the nub of it, like the characters and, you know, like their personalities and their color. Yeah, so it was like a 2-step process, but I wouldn't say that you'd do like I don't think a normal feature would be pitched in that way. Like there was quite a lot of pre-reporting before it even got commissioned, you know, like I'd already spoken to most of these people on the phone multiple times before I got anywhere near booking my flights and going out to Bali. But the for like a long read, I think you do have to do that sort of pre-reporting.
Fantastic. And I've got a question from Simon in the chat just saying, how did you get in contact with the people to interview? Like, did you know somebody, or like were you just contacting people out of the blue? And obviously as well, a question from me on my side, when you are doing a kind of multiple stage process and there is quite a lot of pre-reporting, how do you kind of square that in terms of the finances? Because a lot of the time it's in those situations that you're just like, oh my goodness, I'm putting so much work into this. Is something going to become of it? I think some of that's psychological, right? To reassure yourself that actually, you know, this is crucial. But I think also there must be a point when you say, okay, now I've got enough. Now I take those characters and move the pitch on and definitely secure my expenses and get out on that plane.
Yeah, so with regards to your latter question, so I would not do all that pre-reporting unless the editor had shown interest. So like I wouldn't go away, pre-report all of that and then take it to an editor, because they might hate the idea and have no interest in it, and then it's a waste of time. But if the editor has shown a good level of interest in that story, then I will do that pre-reporting. Unfortunately, long reads are not financially lucrative at all. It's really hard to make a living just from doing long reads. A few people do it, but most of the time you do have to supplement it with other income, just because the amount of time and research it takes, it's not often occasioned by the amount you get paid for them. But I mean, it's my favorite type of journalism, but it's not financially, you know, extremely lucrative. And then in terms of finding those people, so I heard about this phenomenon because I was literally just having dinner with some friends, and they mentioned that one of their friends was doing this, and I thought that's really interesting. I like never heard of that before. So she was my way in. And I would say that if you're a journalist and someone mentions that one of their friends is doing something interesting, then you need to be really annoying and really pushy and basically insist on speaking to them. And she was really good at connecting me with other people in the scene. But then I also did manage to find people. The person I found who had bought the private island had written a Medium post about it, and I sort of stumbled across it. So there was like a small way in, which gave me the idea for the story, which is that I heard people talking about this community in the scene, and I would always say like the number one thing, like as any sort of journalist, but especially a featured journalist, I think, is just be really attentive to what people are saying around you, because like if someone mentions something like that, like that their friends are living in a community and they're selling stuff on the internet to people in America, like always just be like, how, like what's going on there, how are you funding that? Because that was the kernel of that story. It was just a comment that was made around me when I was having dinner with some friends.
That's fantastic. So I think if we move on to the next slide, this you slightly touched on it, wasn't it? Was how you became, how do you got into journalism? And I think the question that follows is also sort of talking a little bit about how you do that without many contacts. So what was your situation? Did you have a lot of contacts and qualifications? How did you what were your kind of early years like?
Yeah, so I like, if anyone takes anything away from this story, it's that you can get into journalism without qualifications, without contacts. It's kind of brutal though, and it will take you a long time, but it is possible. So my journey into journalism was, I did English lit at uni, didn't do any student journalism, like zero. I think I might have done like one article, and then I graduated field, and I was just like so incredibly unhappy and really unfulfilled and also quite bad at my job that I used to just do like a blog on the side. So the blog started out because I just used to like enjoy writing about what I was doing, and my friends were like, oh well, you know, like you like writing, maybe you should do a blog. So I used to do an anonymous blog where I basically write about like my job and how much I hated it, and like going out in London, and like all sorts of stuff, like music reviews, like club nights that I'd been to. It was basically like a blog about like being young and going out and having fun in London. And I mean, blogging is incredibly uncool now, but this was like the mid 2010s, so it wasn't so bad back then. And off the back of that, I literally got approached by like the tiniest local publication. So my blog was called The Dalston Years, and that's why it's still my Twitter handle now. And there was this magazine, it was like an indie magazine in Dalston, and they were basically like looking for writers to write about like the nightlife scene in Dalston. So I started doing a bit of writing for them, and then sort of I started writing quite regularly for them. I mean, they were paying me like £50 an article, £100 an article, like not a lot of money, but I had no experience and I was really happy to have that, and I'm still really happy to have done that. And then
you still at the job that you hated at that point still?
Yeah, still at the job I hated, still doing a terrible job at the job I hated. And then this went on basically for like 3 years. So I was like doing very small bits on the side for this magazine. My editor at that magazine was really, really supportive of me and always trying to like encourage me to pitch to other places. So I used to pitch and do like very like occasional features for like websites like The Debrief, which is now closed down. Got the occasional piece commissioned at Rice. And then, so I'd say over the period of like 3 years, if I was to look at my pitch hit rate, I reckon I was I'd probably put aside like 3 hours in a weekend or every other weekend to just try and do some freelance pitching. Because in my head, I thought, oh, I'm going to build up my freelancing to the point where I'm making enough money from freelancing that I can just quit journalism. And that didn't happen actually. Like everything came to a head quite quickly. But over sort of 2-3 years, I basically was sort of pitching anyone that I could think of, and my pitches were going nowhere. I think my pitch acceptance rate was probably like 5%. Like I literally, nothing was getting commissioned. My pitches weren't very good and I didn't know what I was doing, and I had no contacts. So my hit rate wasn't great, but I did get a few things commissioned. And then in 2015, I basically just quit my job, and I was sort of like kind of probably like jump before you get pushed kind of thing. I think if I hadn't quit my job, and I literally emailed like every single editor who'd ever commissioned me, which is probably about 5 editors in total, and asked if any of them had any work experience. And very fortunately, Vice had an internship going, so I was able to go and do that Vice internship, and that was my route into journalism. Very serendipitous, because that internship was not around for very long and it was paid. But that was how I got my foot in the door. But I guess the lesson that I would share is that there's really nothing to stop you from pitching to editors, and you probably won't get many of your pitches commissioned because you might not have a lot of contacts or experience, they might not know who you are. But in my experience, you will get some commissioned, and if you can turn that trickle into a flood and build relationships with those people, that's a really good route into the industry. And I think a lot of people, when they're trying to get into the industry, they think, oh, they need to get like work experience and a job somewhere, and that is one route into the industry. But another route into the industry is freelancing, and I've seen a lot of people do it. And actually, you only need to find 1 editor or 2 editors who really thinks that you're good, and before you know it, you've got pretty regular work and you are actually making a name and selling cuttings. So I would always just say, like, don't wait for something to fall in your lap, just like start pitching now.
Amazing. And I think that kind of slightly answers Sarah's question in the chat, who said that she started off training as a journalist, but then didn't pursue it. And now she's in her late 40s and just doesn't feel like just pitching is okay, but that it's maybe quite a pushy kind of thing to do. Did you feel like you were being pushy? Did you kind of despair? You know, what I know a lot of freelancers and a lot of young freelancers, and you know, this for me is fascinating, kind of looking at the overall journalism landscape. So many people used to start out in local reporting, but because we don't have those, you know, papers anymore, people do go straight to freelancing, as you say, and it's very possible. But how did you kind of manage that rejection rate? And did you think that you were pushy, or do you feel like there's a different way to pitch that doesn't have to kind of, you know, be that aggressive?
I never felt like I was pushy. It was really dispiriting and disheartening at times, but then the sort of euphoria when you get a commission like sort of made up for it a little bit. I think the thing is if I knew what I knew now about pitching, I'd been a much better freelancer and much better at pitching, because I didn't really know like how to understand what a publication's editorial tone and coverage was and how to pitch to it in a way that was going to maximize my chances of success. Like I would often send over pitches. I think the number one mistake I made was trying to pitch too big. And I would really like, that's the number one thing that I see all the time from people, is that they get disheartened because like they're not getting their pitches accepted by like the New York Times or Vogue or like the Guardian or like big publications. And like you shouldn't be pitching to those publications if you don't have much experience, because you need to work up to that basically. And I think that's another mistake that I made as well, which is like trying to pitch to big publications, and actually editors at those publications won't commission me because I don't know what I'm doing. And like I'm pretty honest about like that looking back, like I did not know what I was doing. And so it's actually so much better in my experience to try and find smaller publications that will like take a chance on you and nurture you, and might not have a lot of money to pay you, but what they'll do is they'll develop you as a writer, and then eventually like you'll get to the point where you've outgrown that publication and they'll be really happy to see you progress onto new publications, because they understand that's like a natural part of like the journalistic ecosystem, is that writers move up and they do better in their careers and they write for bigger places. So I think, yeah, like it obviously is so disheartening, like having all your pitches ignored. Like if I went back through my inbox, I'd find thousands of pitches that were ignored. But I guess you just have to tell yourself that if you are persistent and good and your ideas are good and you work hard enough and you keep knocking on those doors, like they will eventually open. And I really do believe that they will. But I mean, you've just got to be willing to like really, really, there's a lot of hours, there's a lot of effort. Like it took me a long time, like thousands of hours.
Fantastic. I love the idea of the journalism ecosystem, you know, kind of like the animal kingdom and different levels of kind of big and small beasts of publications. I think this kind of, you already really touched on, Amy had a question about like, you write for so many different places. How do you approach new outlets and make contacts there? And I think this, we've had some of your tips as well about getting into journalism.
I'm just sorry, I'm
Oh yeah, that's fine. You're skipping. You're being wonderful with the PowerPoint. Thank you. That was not your role when you signed up to this. You've taken it on brilliantly. I think maybe to Amy's point, what you're talking about just in the chat is essentially that market research, isn't it? Kind of, you know, is that an important thing about when you're approaching new outlets to let them know that you understand what they're about? Is that part of making contacts there, you know, when you cold pitch?
It's hard making contacts at new publications. And I know this sounds like really like kind of bizarre, but you know, like you sort of want to do like a bit of a kind of like mating dance to those publications. And by that, I mean like you want the people at those publications to be noticing your work and thinking it's really good. So what you kind of want to be doing is like, if you want to get in with a publication, try and write for the smaller publications that people at that publication reads. If that makes sense. So like, if you want to write for the Guardian music pages, then it's a really good idea to start writing music features for like The Quietest or Dazed or like Vice, because those are smaller publications and you'll probably have a better chance of getting commission there. But the people who work at the Guardian or whatever outlet it wants will read those publications. So that's like one good thing to do. Like if you want to get in with a new publication, try and write for smaller outlets that people there read. And then when you approach them, you can be like, oh, I wrote this article, and you can link to it. And then they're like, oh, I remember reading that and thinking it was good. I didn't realize you wrote that. And that immediately will help like flick a switch in that editor's brain, which means that they'll be more likely to take a punt on you because they'll have read your work before and think it's good. So that's like one way of doing it. The only other way I'd say is like just read the publication devotedly. Like you really, like when I was an editor at Vice, I could always tell when someone pitched me and they hadn't read my publication. It was just obvious. Like the tone was off, the story wasn't quite right. If you are like really reading that publication all the time and you're noticing stuff like which regular features do they write, like what regular columns do they write, like are there any series that they have that you could maybe pitch into, and that's like a really smart way in as well. Like I'd always say like try and take note of recurring stuff that they're doing, because my experience, editors are always looking for people to fill recurring slots as well.
Brilliant. And do you have any other tips if you don't have those contacts or the qualifications? You've already given us tons, so we can skip to the next story, but is there anything else in your kind of bag of tricks that you would share?
I would say like be a sort of like NSA style data miner. So like one thing that I think is really helpful to do is like write down, Twitter is really good for this. Go on Twitter, find all the editors or all the publications that you like, that you want to write for, put their names in a spreadsheet, put their handles in a spreadsheet, guess what their email addresses are. It's not hard to guess. Most of the time they're just generic email addresses. And then when you have like ideas that you think might work for those publications, you can refer to that spreadsheet and it will really help you in terms of like targeting your pictures. So that's like another good thing to do, like really try and just like research editors and figure out like who's commissioning what. Because a lot of the time looking back at why my pitches weren't successful, it's because I was emailing them to the wrong person. Like I just didn't know who to email these ideas to, because I didn't understand how like the internal like structures. But actually a lot of the time, if you research stuff like that, you can figure it out for yourself. Because if say you want to figure out who's commissioning on, I don't know, like well-being at Refinery 29, like you can follow all of those editors and you can see who's posting work that is on that theme on Twitter or on Instagram, and then you'll know who to pitch to. So yeah, I'd say like really try and, without being a stalker.
I was going to say low level online social media stalking.
Yeah, but don't forget that like they're like potential contacts, and you should like try and research them, because that way your pitches will be more successful.
Definitely. Fantastic. Annabelle, we're going to come to your question because it's actually a really important one. And I always think talking about finances is important, but we're going to go just now to talk about your Vice anti-stalking campaign, which is so relevant since we were talking about stalking online. So you produced the Unfollow Me documentary about the life and death of Alice Ruggles. So I'll find a link and I'll put that in the chat as well for anyone. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, in particular, because we know you've done a lot of investigative work, and I think a lot of people can be quite intimidated by investigative work, and even just those 3 letters, you know, for FOIA, just kind of, I think, can drive fear into the hearts of many people who just don't understand, you know, how to go about that. But what was that experience like? And also, what was the experience like as well of having primarily been a writer and then producing a documentary?
Yeah, so producing the doc was fine because the editorial and production team advice are very closely linked, so that was all good. So Unfollow Me was an anti-stalking investigation / campaign, so that there was the investigative work, and then we built that out into like a sort of awareness campaign, and had political asks as well, which was, we wanted to introduce a stalkers register in the UK which would track serial offenders. One thing that I really, so FOI requests I could talk about for hours. I think they're brilliant, and one thing that I really like about FOI requests is that they're really democratic. Like, you don't need to be in a newsroom, you don't need to have great contacts, you don't need to have worked in Westminster, you don't need to have somebody who's like, you know, a government SPAD like sending you information on WhatsApp. Like, anyone can file them, and you like, so in a way, like, they're actually really good for like people who don't have contacts in journalism, because there's nothing stopping you from doing it. And so the Unfollow Me story, the whole thing started, the whole investigation, which was like a year-long investigation, and we pulled a lot of data together. We showed how many women had been murdered after reporting their ex-boyfriends or husbands or partners to the police, and the police basically doing nothing about it. And we found out that like 60 women had been murdered, so like one a week, despite going to the police for help. And that whole thing started, like so many of my features started from a news story. So I was reading like just literally just the news, I can't remember what website it was, and there was a story there about a girl who had reported her ex-boyfriend to the police for stalking her, and then he murdered her basically in a car park outside her gym. And I remember reading that story and just thinking that it's so horrible and crazy to me that you could go to the police and say someone is stalking me, and they just do nothing, and then you get murdered. And that was like kind of the kernel of the first FOI investigation, which was like, I wonder how many other women have reported their ex-boyfriends to the police and they've been murdered by them. So I would always just say, like, it's really, when you see a story like that and you want to sort of like think about it in a way that might lead to an investigation, just think to yourself, like, has this happened to other people? Is there any data that I can find on this? Because very often, if you look at big investigations, they come out from a single news story like that. So I would really say like learning how to do FOI requests it's quite technical. Like, you can't just email a government department and say, tell me how many people were murdered by their ex-boyfriends after reporting them to the police. Like, in that instance, I had to individually FOI every police force, and there's like 45 police forces in the UK. You have to be very careful in what you ask for, because there's stupid like rules around cost limits and stuff like that. I would actually say, to be honest with you, like, I went on an FOI course. It was run by an organization called the Word Centre, I think it's what it's called. And I think the course cost about £90. I'm not sure exactly because my employers paid for it. And I would really, really recommend that if you want to do investigative FOIs, like, to go on a course like that. Like, obviously it's not super cheap, but it's not like crazy expensive either. And it was a one-day course, and it was really, really helpful, and it really helped me in sort of like learning how to do FOIs. So that's another thing that I would really recommend.
Was that the free word center?
That's it, yeah, the free word
Yeah.
center.
I'm just going to post it right now. So this is the course that Sharon went on.
Definitely recommend it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, and just I'm trying to juggle everybody's questions as they come through, because I know they're going to pile up. So obviously you love to get kind of deep into stories, whether that's investigations or features. How are you kind of, as you said, I'm not sure, maybe investigations do pay much better, but how are you juggling kind of nowadays other work to supplement perhaps the more creative stuff that you love to do, but that doesn't necessarily pay? And do you mind us asking as well, what are the going rates kind of per word for the sort of, you know, stuff that you are writing? Because I know in America, long form writing is a bit more lucrative, and we don't really have that in the States. So, you know, are there any places that obviously you may take a hit just because you love the idea, but are there places that you would aim to try and pitch to because they are a little bit more affordable?
Yeah, so in terms of rates, so I'm actually just trying to remember. The Guardian pays for long reads, I think it's a flat fee of £3,000. I think it's £3,000. I actually can't remember off the top of my head, something like that. Most publications for long reads in the UK, like, you're kind of looking at around 50p a word as your top limit, really. I don't think you'll go much higher than that. The US, I have never written long reads for US publications. I don't know how much they pay. In terms of how I like sort of juggle my finances, so the things that make me money, like the things that are my consistent income streams, is like regular feature writing for The Guardian, because actually most of the time you can turn around those features in much less time than it takes to turn around a long read. Like a long read, the dyslexia long read I wrote for The Guardian was like maybe I think if you looked at the amount of hours I spent on it, it was probably like less than minimum wage per hour. So I just spent so much time working on it. In terms of investigations, is actually one thing I would say to people who want to do investigations is just be really careful about the rate. So the Knoll investigation I did for The Guardian was on a day rate. I needed to be paid a day rate because you don't know an investigation will come off. And that's like, you can't be paid on publication because you might not get it published and your work still needs to be compensated. So if you're pitching investigations into publications, I would say be really, really clear that you either ideally need to be paid on a day rate for your time, or you need to be paid regardless of whether or not it comes off, because most editors should understand that you can't always get an investigation over the line. There's so much stuff that can happen, like legals might kill the story, or contributors might fall apart. Like, so that there needs to be some compensation for your time on that, definitely.
Fantastic, thank you. Should we go to the next slide? I will try and come to some of the other questions later. So yeah, you've touched on this in terms of FOIA. Is there anything else you can add about how to be a successful FOIA journalist? I know when I've kind of attempted it the few times that I have, organization is really important. Having a kind of, do you have a FOIA log of any sort? How do you keep yourself organized? Because as you said, for one story, it wasn't just one FOIA request. You were doing that to 45 different police stations, and it'll be the same with kind of councils or NHS trusts. So how do you keep all that organized? And are there any other things people have to take into consideration?
I've send them to a special email folder otherwise. Yeah, send them to a special email folder or set up a special email address. I'm not very organized. I can't give anyone any organizational tips. I'm not Libertarian, that's my strong suit. Yeah, you just want to stay on top of it. Have a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Oh, we're starting to get some of the, just right on cue, Dion, in the chat and for the presentation. So one of the most well-known investigations you've worked on is the Noel Clarke investigation with Lucy Osborne. We can't ask you anything too specific about that story for legal reasons, but we've got a more generalized question here, and then I'll kind of work through the ones in the chat to see which would be kosher. But this one, we just sort of, what do you think society still needs to do to change its attitudes towards women in reports of sexual assault or violence? And is this, a theme in your work? I think a lot of women sometimes worry about writing about women's issues, but in recent, months, we've seen just how important it is. What do you think from all of the different stories that you've done covering this issue?
I think that there's this surface level sympathy, concern and compassion, but I think a big problem really is that I think that it's all just very superficial. So people actually, they don't, everybody, you find the bad person and the person who's done these terrible things, whoever that person is, Weinstein or whatever, and people just think, oh, okay, we've got rid of this guy, Harvey Weinstein's in jail, everything's fine. But there's actually no recognition of the structures around that person that enabled that to happen at all. And the people around them walk free, and that all the enablers and all those people, there's never any, they will just stay where they are. And then the other thing I would also say as well is that there's just such a surface level response from government towards these issues. So after the Sarah Everard murder, we got streetlights. We got streetlights and £10 million to improve streetlights, and that's absurd. And actually what we need is really sort of systemic reform, putting stalkers on a register sex offenders, so they can't actually go and abuse women with impunity their entire lives, and they have to be tracked and monitored. But no one wants to do that because it's expensive. So I guess what we have right now is lots of rhetoric but not much action. Yeah.
And you mentioned the government there. The question from Dion, and do say if you're not comfortable answering it. They ask, how did you go about doing the Noel Clarke expose for The Guardian without getting caught? And also, would you be willing to do a story like that again, despite the potential government restrictions on journalists? Is that something you speak to?
I mean, the government restrictions on journalists, I don't think would really apply in the Noel story. So I don't think that's something to worry about. I'll be very happy to do a story like that again. Probably not for a little while. It was quite tiring. Yeah. yeah, the Noel story was a really difficult story to do because it was just incredibly legally sensitive and very difficult. And also when you're dealing with so many people and so many women, there was a lot of fact checking that had to go into it as well, which is obviously like hugely time consuming. And that was one of the main things that made it really difficult.
And was it draining emotionally on you?
No, not hearing the testimonies from the women, because I've reported on like gender violence for such a long time. That's not, it sounds awful and like really callous, but I'm kind of used to hearing those stories. Like I'm used to hearing women telling me about like horrible things that have happened to them. But what was really draining was just the sort of the sheer volume of it. Like there were so many testimonies, there were so many women to speak to, there were so many women to fact check. Like that was draining, not like emotionally, just like literally physically. Like it's really tiring to do that work. I was working like 16-hour days for like weeks at a time. So that was draining. But no, I've never found it draining really emotionally speaking to people. It's more just like the actual volume of the work that's tiring more than anything.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think also nowadays, I don't know, I find at least there's so many different ways that you can interact with sources, which is great, you know, to have that kind of ability. But you may be juggling on quite a few different, you know, sort of platforms, or I don't know if you have one way that you, a secure platform, you know, when you're doing investigative work for people to contact you. And if you do, just a rogue question I'm throwing in there, how do you set all of that up? Because obviously so much with, you know, the pandemic, but even I think a lot of reporting nowadays, it is fantastic to get on the ground, but more and more, you know, we're utilizing social networks and technology, and, you know, whether it's Telegram or Signal or, you know, PGP to contact and talk to people. How do you manage that? Because that can be quite arduous, I imagine.
Yeah, so firstly, I'd always say just try and speak to people on the phone as much as possible, because that's generally more secure than sending emails that can be forwarded or screenshotted. And I use Signal. I use Signal throughout the Null story, and Signal does seem to be fairly secure. So yeah, I would also go download Signal. It's quite good.
It's basically like WhatsApp, isn't it? So that's quite handy.
Yeah, not functional, but it's all right.
No, exactly. And what's the name of your cat? Because obviously that's the question everybody's now asking. Your lovely cat.
I can't tell if you can actually see him. He's right in front of me. His name's Larry, and I've got a little kitten on the sofa behind me as well.
Amazing. Just before we go to the next slide, I've just got a really important question, I think, from Katie Scott, which just says, can you talk us through exactly how you fact check? I think sort of, you know, maybe in the olden days, fact checking was something, you know, that a lot of publications probably had big fact checking departments. Now it's almost kind of a relic, only like the New Yorker does. So how do you go through that fact checking, you know, process?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say is like, I don't full-time do investigations. Like I write features week in, week out for The Guardian, and I'm not fact checking those to hell and back. Like it's not necessary, you know. Like if I speak to someone and they say to me that this happened to them, I don't need to like call up their relatives and double check that it did and ask them for proof. But obviously, like on an investigation or like a sort of like a bigger feature or like anything that's legally sensitive, then you do need to fact check. So it kind of depends. Like one thing that we did on the Knoll story was we did a lot of sort of corroboration. So, you know, if someone says that they were at a dinner with someone on that date, can we speak to the person that was at the dinner with you? Do you have like any credit card bills from the time that says that you were at that restaurant? This is like a fictional scenario. So like a lot of like asking to speak to family and friends is really helpful to like help corroborate. Because if you got someone saying something happened and then, you know, and it's their word against someone else's, but then actually they say, well, I went home that evening and told my sister, and I told my housemate, and then the following day I told my boss, and my boss, you know, and I discussed it on WhatsApp, and here are the WhatsApp messages that we discussed it on from the time. And suddenly you do have quite a lot more like really quite compelling contemporaneous evidence. And then in terms of other things, you know, like when I was doing my Loss of the Virus series for The Guardian, a lot of that was also, you know, like asking for hospital records of admissions, like, do you have any screenshots of this? Do you have screenshots of text messages that you sent me that indicate what time the person was admitted to hospital? And those things, like, I think it's really important when you're doing fact checking to make it really clear to the person that you're fact checking with that it's in everybody's best interests, and that it's not because you don't believe their account, but actually people's memories can be really fallible, you know, like people can get stuff wrong, and it's not intentional. It's just really hard to remember what date something happened on like 4 years ago, you know. So like making that like really, really clear to them, like, you know, I will need this documentation, and it will feel a bit intrusive, but it's actually much better that we iron out any inconsistencies now, and like, you know, check that we've got all this evidence that we can stand up the story with, then like, you know, right before publication, everything starts to fall apart. And another thing, you know, it's also a really good way of sussing out people in terms of their level of commitment to the story, and also in terms of their level of truthfulness. You know, like I wrote a story for The Guardian a few months ago, and it was about 2 women who alleged that they were basically, well, they were sexually assaulted by their boss, and then their company sort of covered it up and kind of pushed them out. That's what they alleged. And, you know, those women like freely downloaded their entire WhatsApp history and gave it to me. And that to me is like a good sign, like that, you know, like I'm sure there's plenty of stuff on my WhatsApp that I wouldn't want people to read. And if you're willing to do that for a journalist, and you're willing to have me literally read through your entire WhatsApp chat history to help find dates that will corroborate your account, then that is a really good indication to me that you are being truthful as well. So it can also have a sort of doubly good second motive, which is that you can sort of identify whether or not people are being honest, whether by how much access they're willing to give you to that stuff.
And how often have you had the opposite experience where somebody hasn't actually been truthful, and it's that fact-checking process that has kind of rumbled them? Or has that not been the case? I mean, obviously, you know, finding people in the first place, you know, and a lot of journalism doesn't involve that level of fact-checking. You know, you are taking people sometimes at their word, and there's a lot of obvious things they can say that, you know, would indicate that they were being truthful. But have you ever had a scenario where that fact checking didn't pass muster and you had to drop a source or change a story? Or
yeah, so it wasn't I do think this person was being truthful in their, so yes, that has happened. Like I can think of 2 examples recently, and it was when I started to do, it's one person, it was like an account that they had told me, and when I started to dig into it a bit more and spoke to other people who worked at that place at the time, they immediately said this account is not accurate, like this is not true. And I went back to that person and said, you know, these people have said this. And I actually, the incident in question happened a very long time ago, and I don't actually think that person was intentionally lying. I think that they had just constructed a version of events that helped them accept and understand what had happened to them and process it in a way that felt tolerable. And I really don't think that person was being malicious, but unfortunately the story just didn't check out. You know, like 2 people told me this didn't happen that worked with them, so obviously I dropped it. And then in another instance, it wasn't actually during the fact checking, but it was during the sending over the request for comment to the person, and they came back with the number of sort of counter allegations, and just from looking at the sort of counter allegations and the allegations that have been made, it just seemed very murky. And it was impossible to sort of differentiate, you know, is this a dispute, is this abuse, is this a workplace sort of like mishmash, you know. And I just didn't feel confident at that point. So at that point I did also drop it.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go to the next slide. Operating your own slideshow. Gosh, geez, can't get the staff nowadays, can you? So one of the questions that we had a little earlier in the chat, I'm trying to find who it was that asked, was talking about how you've gone from some quite kind of light writing, and still you mix it up, as you say, you do a lot of features, but you started out, you know, essentially blogging about your life and nightlife and music reviews, and now, you know, you're doing these kind of hardcore, you know, really serious investigative stories. What are some of the skills that you've learned along the way, and what were the maybe apprehensions you had at the beginning, or did it feel quite a kind of natural transition for you?
So like the thing that I would just really emphasize is that I think it's really good to be ambitious and to want to do a type of journalism that pushes you, whatever that is. And I don't actually think that investigative journalism is like the highest form of journalism, although everyone seems to think it is, but I don't think it is. I think there are other forms of journalism that are just as important and valid. But I think a lot of the time people don't understand like the process and the stages that you've been through to like get to that point where you're doing investigative journalism. You know, like you start off, in my case, like it like years of doing like, you know, dumb stories about like viral videos, or like writing blogs about going out, or like all of those things like get you to that point, because but every single thing it hones. Every time, I used to work at Vice and I used to have to turn around like a news story with original reporting by like 2 p.m. And so what that taught me was like writing really fast and like how to like find an expert that can speak to me in like an hour's notice. And then you progress to like doing sort of more difficult features, and that teaches you how to find really hard case studies and how to sift through like Reddit forums and Facebook groups to try and find like people that don't want to speak to you but you want to speak to them. So like basically what I'm saying is that like daring to do like those sort of like big really difficult features, like that's like the end point of like so much work and like so much skill development. And I don't think it's actually even helpful to really say like, right, I'm going to be an investigative journalist from like day one of my career, because like you don't have the skills yet. Like you need to build those skills, and you build those skills by figuring out how to write like quickly, how to write cleanly, how to interview people, how to be a good interviewer, like how to like have a good relationship with editors, how to find difficult case studies, like how to weave them together into a feature, like how to tell when someone's lying to you, and all of that stuff. Like, and I guess there's not really a simple answer to that, because it's basically just like how to be a journalist, and it's like you get better as you get more experience. And so I guess like if you want to do investigative journalism one day, then you should start off by just doing journalism, like any journalism that you can find, because like that will help build your skill level. And then you will eventually find a story that you think is so interesting that you want to really spend a lot of time looking into it. And that story will one day just like pass your radar, and you won't know when it will happen. You will just be reading something and it will like snag, and you'll think, oh, that's really interesting. Or you'll hear something and you'll think, oh, that's really interesting. Or someone will call you and ask you to look into something. And that will be how you do your first investigation. And you can't really plan for it. In my experience, I don't think you can.
That's really cool. And a bit like, I guess, how do you become a marathon runner? I mean, you just got to start running, and you're not going to get, to the full marathon length at the very beginning. That's fantastic. Let's move on to the next question. This is talking about that you mentioned loss to the virus, and we've also spoken about trauma, etc. You said again you've become quite hardened to that. What advice would you have maybe to others starting out who perhaps are not so hardened to it, or even at the very beginning, maybe when you were, if you can remember a kind of time when you were less perhaps sort of casual or blasé about it, and it does, working in a 24/7 TV newsroom until recently, even images of, war and terror attacks, these things, you can become kind of hardened to them. So it is, I think, something that happens in journalism until maybe a day when you just feel terrible and you don't know why, but, something hits a raw nerve. So how do you cope with that?
So I think the thing is that you don't want to like be completely inured to all that stuff, because the minute you do that, you lose your empathy, and then you're not a good writer and you're not a good journalist. Like you have to be empathetic to everyone, and you have to genuinely and sincerely really try to understand their point of view and their position and their perspective and what's happened to them, and treat them with dignity and compassion. So I guess what I would say, like what I've learned, is that you really need to like try and feel it as much as possible, and then let it go as quickly as you felt it. If that makes sense. Like really try and feel exactly what they're feeling, understand exactly what they're feeling, but then just don't hold on to that feeling, is what I've learned. So like, when like Loss of the Virus was a series of like pieces about people who died of COVID, and a lot of the time I'd be on the phone to their relatives, and like literally talking about how they found their relatives dead in bed one day, like the most unbelievably traumatic thing. And like often I'd be like crying during those interviews, like I was really upset and really emotional by it, made emotional by it, but you cannot dwell on it. Like that's what I've learned. Like you cannot dwell on it, and actually like it's not really your pain to dwell on. Like it's not about you. Like how you feel about that story is kind of irrelevant, because it's not your story to feel upset about, is what I like kind of tell myself. And I just like try and feel the empathy, but then try just to let it go, like just let it wash away, is what I would say. And then when dealing with people, like it's so bad, and people just sort of like vampirically leech off people's like trauma, and like they can really tell when you're doing that. Like don't just go in and just try and get like those quotes from people because you need like X quote about terrible thing that happened to them, and then sort of run away. Like treat them how you'd want to be treated in that situation. Like speak to them for as long as they like, be really available to them, like stay in contact with them, like be respectful, and you'll write a better piece, and you'll also minimize the damage that can have on someone. And I would also just say, like, that person, if they want to speak to you, so they've already probably been through the most awful thing ever, and if they want to speak to you about it, like speak to a journalist about it, they're probably pretty strong, like they probably already made that decision that they want to talk to you about it. So you don't have to be absolutely terrified that you're gonna like traumatize them, because to be honest, they're already traumatized by what's happened to them. And so all you have to do is just try to be as accurate and faithful to their account of events, and try to just really just do justice to what happened to them as much as you can, you know. My experience, like, you don't people can be asked difficult questions, like they can deal with that. Like, often there's a tendency to try and avoid those questions, but like if something awful's already happened to them and they're strong enough to talk to you about it, you can probably ask them about it.
Fantastic, thank you. That was, it's not your pain to dwell on. That's fantastic. And also I think as well, as an industry, you know, journalists can get a bad reputation as being sort of vampires or ambulance chasers or whatever. So even if for yourself, you know, you're not too bothered about asking, you know, those sorts of questions, think as well about, you know, your colleagues, because the next time somebody, you know, they might need to talk to another journalist, they may not want to, which, you know, might be a problem. Let's move on to the next slide. While we do that, because this question may, you may know the answer to this immediately, the most interesting, coolest person you've interviewed for a story, but if not, you can think about it. And in the meantime, I will ask you a question that's come from Andrew in the chat, which is, what are the pros and cons of being in a newsroom versus being freelance? And he's written single newsroom, so I assume that means not kind of freelancing around in different newsrooms, but maybe being staff or just choosing one place to work versus freelance. And why do you prefer, assuming you do, freelancing? Because I think you've only, well, Vice, maybe you were staff at Vice.
I was staff at Vice, and before that I was briefly staff at Days, which is like a smaller magazine. I don't think I'm a natural freelancer. I enjoy freelancing now because it gives me the freedom to do the work that I want to do, and it's really nice not having to commute to an office. The benefits of having, so I've never really been in like a traditional newsroom, like a sort of newspaper newsroom, but Vice did cover news, and I was a staffer there. The advantages of being, I would really say early in your career, it is so helpful to try and be in a staff job. And I know that's like an incredibly infuriating thing to say, because I know that those jobs basically are really hard to get and don't really exist. But it was really helpful for me because I didn't really know what I was doing, and just being able to sit next to like a really talented editor, like my old boss, and just like watch what she was doing and like watch how she handled interviews and ask her questions, like that was incredibly helpful. So that's like just learning on the job. It's a lot easier to learn on the job when you're a staffer, and it's a lot easier to sort of like branch out in different directions, you know, like, oh, I'm a news writer, but I actually want to do this big investigation, and can I also produce this film? You know, like you can't do that when you're freelance. That said, like what I like now about my job is that, like, as a freelancer, it's almost like so much more pure. Like I literally just write articles, pitch them, and that's it, you know. I don't have to sit in meetings about stuff that I don't really care about, and you know, like I don't know, like do weird HR stuff that like I've been mandated, and all of that stuff that's like not your job, that you end up having to do when you have a job, like all of those meetings that you don't really need to be in, all of those conversations you don't really need to have, all those times you need to like pick up someone else's slack because they're on holiday. Like I don't ever have to do any of that. Like I literally just feel like I just do the work now with none of the stuff that goes around it. So that's quite nice.
How do you manage though? Like, I mean, because a lot of people say that when you're a freelancer, you're kind of like a business of one. Have you then managed some kind of snazzy way of sorting out your invoices? You've mentioned a couple of times that you're not very good organizationally. Is there anything, because a lot of people I think are put off by that, about, you know, just the fact that there are other forms of HR maybe that only pertain to you, but they still exist, and chasing invoices is, you know, a natural one.
Yeah, I mean, that sucks. Schedule sends. You can schedule send that stuff. Just like, I mean, I always used to just like Friday afternoon, just be like watching like some crappy BBC Three documentary, and then you just like schedule send all your chase emails that you have to do yourself. Yeah, I mean, that admin is tedious. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like I'm doing my tax return at the moment, and it sucks. Like it really sucks. But that's just one of the downsides of the job, unfortunately. You just have to get an accountant if you can.
Perfect advice. So you've had a bit of time to think. The most interesting, coolest person you've interviewed for a story.
Oh, definitely. I profiled her for Vogue.
Who was that?
Malala Yousafzai.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. It was like quite embarrassing. I try not to take pictures of people I interview because it's just a bit embarrassing, but I was just so overwhelmed by how amazing she was. I was like, please can we get loads of pictures? And she's just great. She's like so inspirational, and such, and also just like what was so great about Malala is that she's like obviously like one of the I think the youngest Nobel laureate in the world, like graduated from Oxford, like this amazing activist, like got shot by the Taliban, like all this stuff. But like she gave me just the most incredible access, and it was just, I've interviewed genuinely like people from Love Island who won't speak to me without having the questions sent over in advance and having their PR person on the phone call. And Malala like literally just did like an hour and a half Zoom and then met me for like half a day in London, and I could just ask her anything I wanted, and it was just me and her. I was like, wow, this is like crazy. You never get this access. And that made me really like her a lot, actually, because I really felt like she had nothing to hide and she was just truthful, like, in exactly who she was. And I think that really came across in the piece as well, which is that she was just like a very sincere person. So yeah, I think she's very cool.
And how did that interview come about? Out of curiosity.
I was asked to do it by Vogue, so she was going to be on the cover. So they just like, they normally, for cover stories, they normally just match the writer. It's not like the writer will pitch it; they'll just pick the person and then they'll pick the writer.
And how did that feel? Because that must have felt like quite a career moment.
Yeah, definitely. I was really happy to do it, and really happy that it was her. I think like mostly the fact that it was just her, because I just think that she's so great, and I've been such a fan of her for such a long time. And it was really, really nice to be able to go away and do all the research into her as well, like to read her book and like watch her documentary and all that stuff. But actually, yeah, it was like, this is like work. Doesn't feel like work. And what was really interesting about that as well was that the more you get to know someone, like the more your perception of them changes. Like the questions that I thought I was going to ask her was totally not the questions I ended up asking her, because the more you get to know them, the more you kind of get a sense of who they are. So that was also really good.
Really interesting. Fantastic. We're going to go to pretty much the last question on the slideshow, and this sort of keys in with what Alice has written about your piece about GPS tracking cats, which actually, weirdly, my cat has not come home for 5 days now, and he's got a tile on his collar, and I'm starting to worry. So I'm really interested in this one. But if you flick onto the next slide, question basically is really one that we've kind of brought up previously about how you balance quite serious stories and then quite quirky stories. But how does that evolve your writing style? We had a question previously in the chat, which I've kind of saved because I knew this slide was coming up. How do you go about, we talk about developing contacts, we talk about developing, reporting skills, but what about the writing skills, and how does that change depending on the piece that you're focusing on?
Yeah, so I maintain that the hardest type of pieces to write are funny pieces. I think it's the hardest type of writing that you can do, and that's why I really love to occasionally do like lighthearted funny pieces. I would never want to just only write like really serious features, because I love the craft of writing a humorous piece, and that it's really difficult. It's really difficult to be funny. And people who are like consistently funny, like Joel Groby or Stuart Heritage, like two very funny writers, I'm like, wow, it's just, I think that's like the hardest type of journalism you can do. So I don't really have like any sort of like big advice in terms of like how to like broaden your range, because I just think your range is by definition what you're interested in. Like if you're interested in doing these stories, then you will end up finding a way to do them. But in terms of like writing humorously, I would say like always a lighter touch is better, and try to be keen to the sort of contradictions or the absurdities or the sort of moments of sort of self-aggrandizement, or the moments when people are quite clearly presenting a version of themselves that is not actually who they are. Like all of those things, that's the stuff that comic writers look for. Like those little details that can often be very hilarious, or like trying to find like one thing they did that was sort of, you can exaggerate in a way that makes it kind of funny, not exaggerate in an untruthful way, but like you can pull out. But it's honestly really difficult. And the only thing I would say, like as with all writing, is that you get better at writing by writing, obviously, and by reading. So if you want to be like good at a certain type of writing, then read loads of writing from writers that you think are good that do that. Whether it's like you want to be an amazing profile writer, or then read like Laura Snapes or Simon Hattenson, because they're like really great profile writers, and see what they're doing and like see what their craft is. Like that, there's not really like anything that I can say other than just like read lots and note it and be careful in like sort of how you read it and what you're taking in.
Fantastic. And I think that is a perfect place to end the conversation, partly because it's 8 o'clock and we can't keep you from your wonderful cats much longer, but also because I think it is so true. And I would love everybody who has joined us on this session to go away, and if you've got Twitter or whatever social media you've got, use the hashtag PressPad Remote, tag Sirin in it, it's at the Dalston Years, and tell us something that you've learned from this session or from reading one of her pieces. I've put all of the links there to some that we've mentioned. Just let her know, because she's absolutely right. That's the only way that you do learn. And even, you know, when you're much older, you're constantly learning from your colleagues, which is just fantastic. So thank you so much, Sirin. Everyone else is saying thank you in the comments. You've been so wonderful, a great guest, including the cameo from Larry.
I'm sure you could see him because I had my screen up on like full, so I couldn't tell what you could see. Yeah, he's there.
I love it. My cat's always doing that. You're lucky that it wasn't a kind of full sweep and a kind of tail in the face.
You're lucky it wasn't that. Like,
yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for giving your evening over to us, and thank you for everyone else for joining. And thank you as well just for supporting PressPad and helping young people get to where you are and being such an inspiration. So have a lovely evening, and same to everyone else, and see you guys all on social. Do put your comments in.
Bye everyone.
Bye. Bye.